Hi, and welcome to our training on peer support, best practices for working with individuals with brain injury. My name is Anastasia Edmonston, and I'm a consultant with the National Association of State Head Injury Administrators at NASHIA.org. And our mission is to support states, grow leaders, and connect partners with us, those of us doing the work. Of working on developing our state brain injury programs and working with our partner. So I am going to just give the disclaimer and the credit. This project was made possible by a grant from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and its contents are solely the responsibility of the authors and do not necessarily present the official views of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. So NASHIA's mission is we are a nonprofit organization created to assist state government in promoting partnerships and building systems to meet the needs of individuals with brain injury and their families. So I'm just going to start this. This is kind of a rhetorical question, but as we start to dig in the content, be thinking to yourself, why is it important for peers to know about brain injury? Why have we been asked to share this content and make it available for peers? Well, one huge reason is brain injury is often invisible. So people commonly make good physical recovery from even a moderate to severe brain injury, especially if it happened when they're young. So they may look like they are developing in a typical way, even into adulthood. And some of the behaviors that may lead them into contact with the criminal justice system, they're not connected to that earlier injury in their life. And then on the other end of the brain injury severity spectrum is mild TBI. And folks typically, cover this a little bit more later, but just know that one and done, a lot of us have had concussions and we're back to ourselves pretty quickly. But when we have multiple mild traumatic brain injuries, so mild TBIs, same thing as concussion. So folks who've had multiple mild TBIs over the course of their life, they do add up. And so you may see folks living with the consequences of those injuries in your facilities, in your services. And often symptoms can be misdiagnosed or misunderstood by providers. They might not even know that the individual in front of them, say in a substance use services program, in a mental health program, the parole and probation officer or agent may not connect some of the things they're seeing, behaviors and patterns that get in the person's way of moving on in their life, say after release, not connecting it to an earlier brain injury. So it's important to understand through a brain injury informed lens what are some of the symptoms and signs of brain injury that are getting in people's way of really living their best lives, and how can we support them. And if they're not diagnosed properly, if they're not accommodated properly, then people tend to kind of go through that revolving door within the criminal justice system, getting back into the system, not making their appointments with a parole and probation officer. So all these things can really lead to difficulties in transitioning back to the community and the individual themselves. I grew up at a time where lots of us got our bell rung, told to shake it off and, get back in the game or stop being such a baby, you're fine. We now know better that even a mild traumatic brain injury or concussion may have some more consequences than we used to think. And so that individual is like, yeah, of course I played football in high school. My dad did knock me around a little bit. Didn't everybody's dad? And so not connecting those insults to their brain to some of the challenges they're having that may have led them again into contact with the criminal justice, criminal legal system. And so they are hidden. So that's again why it's so important that we share this information with you. They're more likely, folks who do have this history of brain injury, are more likely to have co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders. Recognizing this and the utilization of accommodations can really improve engagement in reentry programs and also within the walls to be able to benefit from the services that are provided for individuals who are incarcerated in terms of mental health and substance use treatment. And then once folks are released, understanding of brain injuries and their history, make those brain injury informed referrals as they go back to the community. So what do we hope to accomplish here? Just to increase knowledge. Knowledge is power, and understanding of the lives of individuals who are living with brain injury. Become familiar with the types of brain injury, the causes, and who may be impacted. Comprehend how living with a brain injury can impact our physical, our cognitive, or thinking, and social emotional health and well-being, not only on the individual, but there's a cost to society, and we'll touch upon that as well, and their immediate family and community. Assess the significance of the relationship between brain injury, mental health, and problematic substance use and substance use disorders. Comprehend the relevant connection between a history of brain injury and criminal justice involvement. Facilitate discussion of how best to approach learning about brain injury that is culturally informed, and introduce some tools and tips to connect with and support individuals who do have a history of brain injury, and become familiar with what is available with brain injury informed accommodations and supports and resources. There's quite a lot out there, but how would you know unless you know? So that's another big purpose of this webinar, is to give you those tools so that you can take them, apply it to the knowledge that you already have about working with people with behavioral health conditions. Just do it in a more brain injury informed lens and make sure, to the best of your ability, to connect them to services. So I'm going to give you a quick pre-quiz, basically just to get the juices flowing. So as you're watching this, write down a few quick answers. So, traumatic brain injury can result from a fall, B, an assault, C, a motor vehicle crash, D, all of the above. And I am hoping that all of you are like, well, of course, Stacia, it's D, all of the above. And if you did think that, you would be correct. So there's many ways a person can hurt their brain. But these are three of the most common, and number one is falls. I'll talk a little bit probably about that later, but anybody can fall, especially our older adults. And your brain, of course, can be hurt in such a situation. So my next question for you is, at what age is our brain considered to be mature? One is it firing on all four cylinders, when we can make pretty well-informed decisions because our brain is biologically mature. And if you're thinking, I think that's probably 25 or so, again, you would be correct. And some of that has been in the news. I've known for past few years that people usually give me that answer, which is correct, 25 on average. There is a little difference between men and women, biologically at birth, men and women. We know that women get there first, 23, 24. So you might see, if you've raised kids or kids or you were a kid, that it seems like the girls had it going on a little bit better in middle school. But the guys catch up. So now we're going to talk about brain injury, kind of a brain injury 101. None of this is really detailed. It's not medical information. I really want to share with you some functional content that you can use. So here we go. This is the definition. So you may hear the term ABI. That's acquired brain injuries, and that is the umbrella term And underneath the umbrella, we have two categories. We have non-traumatic and traumatic. Now, non-traumatic is something that happens internally. It's not something that you see from a fall, but it still can have consequences that are just as significant as those ones that I talked about earlier, say from a fall. So, stroke, loss of oxygen to the brain that results from a non-fatal overdose or overdoses, long-term substance use, and strangulation. In other words, anything that cuts off air to your brain, oxygen to your brain, can result in an acquired brain injury. Infectious and metabolic disorders. So if somebody has a brain infection like a meningitis or encephalitis, that can cause similar issues to a TBI, a brain tumor. Many people, unfortunately, will have a brain tumor that, well, fortunately, it's not fatal, but if the surgeon has to go through critical parts of the brain that we need for thinking and decision making, then that person may have a resulting acquired brain injury, can benefit from support and services. And then neurotoxin. So the most common, really, to my mind, is lead poisoning and carbon monoxide poisoning. So, especially if you have an older housing stock, kids could be exposed to that. And then substance use and misuse over time can be injurious to the brain. And then neurodegenerative disorders. So, folks who are having things like dementia, those kind of things. So I'm sorry, that's hard to see, but it's neurodegenerative disorders over time. And then traumatic brain injuries is from an external force that's coming from outside the brain. So again, we say falls, motor vehicle accidents, sports and recreational activities, military service. And there has been quite a bit in the news regarding over the years, because it's been a while now, the Afghan and Iraq conflicts, and TBI, traumatic brain injury, was considered the signature wound of the war. But most brain injuries that happen to our military, they don't happen in the majority of them do not happen in theater. They do not happen in combat. So according to the Department of Defense, traumatic brain injury is not uncommon on base. It's related to training. It's related to very active young people being risk takers. That's their personality in their recreational activities. Things like motorcycles, mountain climbing, and also parachuting. So that can be recreation, but also it can be part of your military job. So coming down out of a plane on a parachute, that contact with the ground can put shake up your brain. Might as well shake up your body. So there's several excellent fact sheets at health.mil that includes information and resources to help the military community prevent, recognize, and support members who are recovering from traumatic brain injury. So there's a lot out there for that group, and deservedly so. Interpersonal violence. So if you think about it, most of the injuries that are sustained by an individual who's a victim of intimate partner violence happens to the head, neck, and face. And your brain's in there. So shaken, being shook, being pushed, thrown down the stairs. We know that lack of oxygen to the brain, an acquired brain injury, also is a frequent thing that happens in interpersonal violence because strangulation is a common mechanism of injury. And then non-fatal self-harming. So, folks who may do a loss of oxygen and sexual activity, folks who will do whippets, that's what we used to call them when I was a kid. So huffing. So recreationally or as a way of dealing with anxiety, non-fatal self-harming can also cause a traumatic brain injury. So brain injury is something, of course, that's as old as time. It's a problem across the globe. In 2019, there was 27.16 million new cases of moderate to severe traumatic brain injury worldwide. Those are the cases that we know about. We know that not every brain injury is counted, not every brain injury is recognized in a medical setting. Countries with higher incident rates were primarily distributed in Central and Eastern Europe and Australia. More males than females. That's a pretty common trend. And it's estimated that TBI causes an annual loss of more than $400 billion to the international economy, along with significant challenges to individuals and their families and their communities. And at least 100 to 300,000, 100,000 people globally seek medical attention for a mild TBI. Again, many people do not think it is necessary to seek medical attention for what they perceive as kind of no big deal, especially if they did not lose consciousness. So in our country, in the US, in the general population, 17% of those report, and those of us civilians, a positive lifetime history of at least one traumatic brain injury, did not seek or receive medical attention. And 176 TBI-related deaths occur each day. And from the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, in 2016, they reported the average cost of non-fatal traumatic brain injuries per person initially treated in the emergency department was approximately $4,530 in related medical spending and $1,500 in work loss over the year. And these costs, of course, are higher for those who require inpatient care. And that total is on average $51,241 in medical expenses and $6,110, in lost work. So having a known or unknown history of brain injury is not uncommon among the general population. So here's just a few fast facts. At least 214,110 TBI-related hospitalizations, and then over 69,000 related deaths. And that was for 2021. And I can't stress enough, these do not reflect people who do not show up at the emergency department, folks who go to the primary care physician, people who go to an urgent care center, and those who are untreated for a mild brain injury, those do not show up. Those incidents do not show up in the counting. So the numbers that we have are from folks who present to the emergency department and or are hospitalized. Falls are the leading cause of traumatic brain injury in the United States, impacting primarily older adults. Be thinking about why that is, and children. So for older adults, the good news is that older adults, people are living longer, they're more active. But the flip side of that is there's some things that happen naturally with aging, vision changes, reaction time can change, balance can change. If somebody's living with, say, diabetes, and they have some loss of sensation in their feet, they may be a little uneven in their walking, and they're fine perhaps at home, but when they go out into the community, they weren't expecting that step. They weren't expecting that curve. They did not see it. Their reaction time is not as quick. So older adults are the biggest group of Americans who incur a traumatic brain injury through falls. And then the other group is children. You can think about it, little ones, especially toddlers, don't quite have their sense of balance in place yet. And so they also are vulnerable to TBI from falls, and their judgment's not so good. They may jump off the steps or take their big wheels, down the street and go off the side of the curb, etc. So those are the two groups that are vulnerable. And then firearm-related suicide is the most common cause of traumatic brain injury death in this country. And this is particularly true of older adult males, white males, and adolescents. So talking about motor vehicle crashes, two leading causes, second leading cause of brain injury. And then just a little bit of factoids here. These are kind of interesting, I think, that the adult brain weighs 3 pounds. That is how big your brain is if you're an adult watching this. And it reaches this weight when we are 12 years old. But I ask you, would you consider, expect a 12-year-old to hold down a job, take care of the taxes, do the things that we expect adults to do? Of course not. So this brain is fully into its adult size, but everything's not hooked up yet, right? And so we also know, this is kind of all related, that the last part of your brain is the frontal lobe, right here. We're going to break down what the frontal lobe does in a little bit. But the frontal lobe is the last to develop in young people, right? So if somebody experienced a brain injury or injuries before the frontal lobe and its neighbor, the temporal lobe, are developed, they may look perfectly okay. And they may look like they recovered really well from that traumatic brain injury they had at age 7, for example. They get back to elementary school. Maybe they have some therapy. The school nurse knows they need a nap after lunch to be at their best. Family is providing some support, and people breathe a sigh of relief and think, "Oh my goodness, thank God he or she is back to themselves. It's smooth sailing from here." But by the time they reach middle school, the consequences of that injury a few years back may start to be apparent. And the reason is that kids grow into their brain injury. So what do I mean by that? For neurotypically developing kids, the parts of the brain responsible for behavioral regulation, knowing when to keep your mouth shut when you should, knowing when to keep your hands to yourself when you should, a basic judgment, is expected to come online at about middle school. And if you had that earlier history of a brain injury and you go into that new challenging environment of middle school, the demands are very different. And for the first 2 weeks, most kids have a period of adjustment. They have to figure out where they are, where's their lockers, what are the combinations, who are they going to sit with at lunch, how do they find their way around this new, bigger school? But by 2 weeks, they're usually fine, right? They got the lay of the land. They've made some new friends. But the kid who had a brain injury starts that middle school experience and is not able to adjust, is not able to learn these new challenges, not able to manage, 7 notebooks for 7 classes. And so that kid, if the brain injury that they had earlier is not connected to the behaviors and the challenges they're having academically in middle school, they may very well be thought to have attention deficit disorder, conduct disorder if they're mouthing off to their teacher, if they're not showing up when they should, if they can't organize their work. And so these kids often are at a disadvantage because they're not able to say, "Hey, I had a brain injury, and that's why I'm acting like this. That's why I'm the class clown. That's why I distract myself and others. That's why I'm telling my science teacher that he's a big fat loser. That's why the vice principal sees me a lot more than she wished she did." And I'm not excusing this kind of behavior, but it's important for us to keep in mind because as these kids move on through school, if they're not supported in a brain injury informed way, some maybe additional time aside to work on their organization of their assignments, things like that, then that kid is always going to be kind of behind the 8 ball in terms of adjusting to the developmental trajectory that we expect kids to be able to navigate as they move through elementary, middle, high school, and beyond. And we'll talk about what some of those consequences can be, not only for kids who have an injury early in their development, but also for adults. But before we do that, I want to level set about severity. So we've already talked about mild TBI being the same thing as concussion. And the good news is that 80% of mild injuries, of brain injuries in general, are mild. And so the tricky part is that you can have a loss of consciousness, but it's going to be short. But a lot of people will have a mild TBI and have no loss of consciousness. And this is why we believe for so long we thought you had a concussion, you came back to yourself, they're good to go. They weren't in a coma, they weren't unconscious. What we now appreciate is that people could have, even though they look like they're awake, they could be in what's called post-traumatic amnesia. So with mild TBIs, it's usually less than an hour period of time. But this is why we take athletes aside, not only children, child athletes, but also NFL and NHL and all the professionals. This is why if a person in the military has had a concussion, all these folks now, best practice is to do an assessment. So, okay, so they can tell me their name, they can tell me maybe who the president is. And so we used to think they're good to go back in, right, to whatever it is they were doing before they get their head hit. But now we know that we have to challenge them a little. We have to see if they're in this post-traumatic amnesia period where the lights are on. They can answer very well-known questions, but nobody's really home, right? So the brain is working on fixing the boo from that hit to their head. And so the brain is not taking in new information. It is not assessing the situation. It is not able to take in that new information again and then respond to it, right? So to relay it after taking it in. So this is why you have sideline assessments where the person's given new information. Okay, Stacia, I'm going to read you 3 names, and I want you to tell me what those names are after we do this other thing. We're going to do a little conversation first, and then we're going to go back to those 3 names. So remember these names: Sue, John, Sam. Okay? Okay. I'm asked something else. If you have other questions, what's your phone number? Then they say, okay, Stacia, what were those 3 names? And I'm like, what 3 names? I don't remember. Maybe I remember one of them, or maybe I don't remember any of them. I am in post-traumatic amnesia. I cannot take in, hang on to, and then give back anything new at the moment that typically resolves. So that's the good news about mild TBIs. But what we don't want to do, and this is why we assess folks, we don't want them going back into a situation where they could have another injury too soon. So that is why we have those sideline assessments. And that's why somebody who's had their bell rung, so to speak, needs to be really mindful of not putting themselves at risk again. A moderate traumatic brain injury, and this is only 10 to 13% of all brain injuries, you will have a loss of consciousness that's longer. So 30 minutes to a whole day, 24 hours. And you'll have that kind of fog, that post-traumatic amnesia. And you may be more likely to have some thinking problems and some physical challenges following that injury. And then we have severe traumatic brain injury. There is no doubt that that person suffered a very severe injury. They will be in a coma, loss of consciousness for over 24 hours, often days, months, or even years. And we are very grateful that there's only, a small percentage of people who have a brain injury where they have that level, that severe level of injury. So that's how it's broken down. And I just want to stress that even though somebody's had a mild brain injury, they still could have pretty significant consequences going forward, especially if they were receiving more than one in a short period of time. So multiple mild traumatic brain injuries can add up to similar consequences as a more severe brain injury. So who is affected by this? Where do we see this in our population? So folks who seem to be overrepresented are found in homeless services programming, people who have housing instability, and it's about 50% plus of folks who are not housed or at risk of losing their housing have a history of traumatic brain injury. People who, and I've already alluded to this, people who are victims of intimate partner violence, about 50 to 90% of intimate partner violence related assaults are to the head, neck, and face, and estimates of strangulation. I already mentioned that, but now we have some data. About 57.6 to 68% is involved in intimate partner violence. So those are all injuries to the brain. And then, of course, people who are living with substance use or mental health disorders or conditions, having one or more brain injuries with a loss of consciousness is associated with greater risk for behavioral health problems, including problematic substance use, beginning in adolescence, and more psychiatric symptoms and a significantly elevated risk of suicide. So unfortunately, 2 to 4 times higher risk of completed suicide if you have a history of brain injury. So what about people who are justice involved? I have found this really interesting article that really breaks down the causes of traumatic brain injury, both before and while incarcerated. And just by dint of the work that I do, I can verify that I've heard similar stories from the people that I've worked with over the years, and from our correctional officers here in Maryland. So according to this article from Prison Legal News, it says before incarceration, individuals are exposed to traumatic brain injury through all the reasons we've already discussed, assaults, motor vehicle crashes, sports and recreational related injuries. And while incarcerated, individuals may be exposed to additional traumatic brain injuries from encounters with other prisoners, including gang initiation beatings. This is referred to as inducing damage to somebody that causes their brain to swell. And it's unfortunately phrase term called pumpkinhead. And in self-inflicted head injury, especially among those who spend time in solitary confinement, just last year, we spoke to some correctional officers, and one of the officers approached us and said, there's this guy, I'm really worried about him. He had been in here before he was hit by a car, but now he's in here a lot more often. He keeps doing dumb things. He keeps getting rearrested. And then because his judgment is so bad and he says things he shouldn't to the other inmates, he's in solitary confinement. And when he's there, he's been hitting his head against the wall really hard. And so we provided him with some ways of intervening and supporting that individual. So when you start to talk to public safety and law enforcement professionals, you'll start to see the through line of how brain injury does show up in the criminal justice system. And if you are working with folks who are justice involved, I'm sure you're thinking back to some people that you know or have known, and you wonder, I wonder if this is one of the factors in how they became, involved in the system. And so that same article shared this really interesting story. We'll call him Scott. And he was incarcerated in a jail in Denver, Colorado. He suffered a traumatic brain injury at age 5 at the hands of his foster father. He has been struck on the head by a baseball bat, a crescent wrench, this as a young person and young adult, and then by gang members who assaulted him while he was incarcerated. And so he deals with the consequences of those assaults. For him, it's agitation, restlessness, sweats, and seizures. So he's got physical and cognitive and behavioral consequences from that brain injury. And thankfully for him, he was in the right place at the right time. There was a program run with in conjunction with the University of Denver. And so it offered treatment. Well, first they offered assessment for a history of brain injury. And if you were positive for that history, You were able to enroll in a program while you were in the detention center, in which the jail staff take extra time explaining things to them, to the individuals who enrolled, allowing, in Scott's case, time to process information, because often the ability to really pay attention to what the correctional officers and other staff are saying, it might take a minute to really absorb it and then respond to it. And if somebody doesn't respond right away, if you don't know if they have a brain injury, you could interpret that as them being disrespectful. So educating not only the individuals, but the staff supporting them. He attends cognitive training courses, and he augments his therapy and cognitive training with psychiatric medication that is recommended for people who are living this history. So I've given you a few stories, a few explanations as to why, and let's now dig into the brain. Now, this is not a neuroanatomy class, but I think it's really helpful to know why somebody is having these issues. Why is our brain so vulnerable? And when I first appreciated what the skull looked like from the inside, it was a light bulb for me in my career, because you can see, and I have little arrows pointing there, you can see those bony ridges, right? And those are here, kind of right where that important frontal lobe sits. And if there's a lot of pressure, force applied to that brain. So from shaken baby, shaken adult, I'm driving and somebody rear ends me. My brain and body go quickly forward. And so my brain does, and with enough force, go back and forth in the skull, and it rubs up against those ridges in that very critical part of your skull. So in your brain. So that is really interesting to me, and explains a lot why we see people with traumatic brain injury from a variety of mechanisms. And honestly, this is something that I did not know until maybe 15 years ago. I don't have to have a direct hit to that beautiful frontal lobe. I could have been hit from the side. I could have been hit from behind. If there's enough force, my soft jello brain can go into those ridges. My frontal lobe could make contact and have some of the damage that can result in some of the functions that you see here. So the term that you commonly probably hear is executive skills or executive functioning, otherwise known as our higher cognitive function. So this is what separates us from some of our friends in the animal world, right? We're able to look at a problem or situation, think about it, wonder about how we're going to approach it, execute our plan. And then this is the beauty of executive skills, especially in adulthood, is that you're able to say, gee, my plan's not working. The way that I thought that I could approach this problem and situation isn't going to happen. So I am going to think about plan B. After a brain injury, being flexible in our thinking can really be impacted. Being able to spontaneously address a problem or situation. Our memory, especially for new information, we're going to remember the old stuff, but the newer stuff since the injury or injuries, it might be harder to pull that forward and apply it to a new problem or situation. Our ability to communicate, it's not so much speaking, like the mechanics of being able to speak. It's more the ability to put words to our thoughts and then convey them to others. So the language piece of it. Motivation. And I just want to say, this motivation we're referring to, it's not, well, do I feel like working today or do I not? This is more the brain's ability to say, this is the next thing I need to do. I need to take care of this. This is the next natural step. And so what happens is people, like the starter button, as one of my former supervisor called it, our starter button's not working. And before I go any further, I just want to say, I hope that as I'm talking, you think about, so these things could be misinterpreted as person's not motivated. Really, they're lazy. They're not interested. They're not engaged. They're my way or the highway because I don't agree with their solution to this problem. So the flexibility and the ability to juggle, circumstances and approaches as things change, as circumstances change, that flexibility is often not as available to people living with a brain injury. And so their judgment could be off. And we tell officers when we train them here in Maryland, you may scratch your head and say, what was he thinking? Why is he telling me to F off? Why is he looking like he's going to run away from me? What is he thinking? Well, he's not. He's going right to the impulse because that ability to take a measured beat, and kind of parse things out and make a good decision for myself and for others is just not as available to somebody with a brain injury. And it's especially impacted if it's a very high stress situation. So, again, impulse control, saying or doing things not in their best interest. And this can lead to social and sexual behavior that is not considered appropriate, in situations. The person may respond to their supervisor at work as if they were their best friend. They may tell a female officer, if it's a young man, I'm wondering if you could go out with me this weekend. Things like that. So the frontal lobe, this executive center of our brain, is just not working. So now I'm going to give just a little bit more content around frontal lobe consequences. So I've already talked about doing things not in their own best interest, but I do want to stress that this is seen over and over again within correctional facilities, as well as in community with law enforcement. So telling somebody in authority what you think of them, it's not a good approach. And when that happens over and over again, it could be to the correctional officer, it could be to the substance use treatment professional, mental health treatment professional who works in the facility. You're kind of stretching that social support that's potentially there. And we also see sometimes it generate to the peers, like not being able to engage with their fellow inmates in a way that's supportive. So again, those consequences of problem solving, and then another way of looking at the motivation that I just described is initiation. And so somebody might be able to start something, but they cannot follow it through completion. So it's initiation and then sustaining that initiation. So just some food for thought. If you are supporting an individual who has some of these issues, looking at it through a brain injury informed lens, think about how those behaviors might impact their life, as they're going back to the community or if they're still behind the wall. Reflect on how you might help them become more aware and how they might be able to take a self-observant stance and maybe start to work with you to generate some alternatives in terms of how they respond and react. Reflect on how these behaviors may have contributed to involvement in the criminal justice system. I've been in this field a long time, and I've seen the high connection of criminal justice involvement with folks who are living with a brain injury. And I will have to say that these are not folks who have committed crimes that required a lot of forethought and planning. These are definitely related to poor judgment, decision-making, and often related to substance use. So these are not folks whose crimes are because of a deep-rooted criminology, I believe, in my opinion. I'm not excusing their behavior, but they're more rooted in just not having the cognitive apparatus, the equipment to make good decisions. Now we're going to talk about the temporal lobe. So it's also critical to a lot of our emotions and our mature behaviors. And for folks who've got damage to this part of their brain, it can be related to aggressiveness and sexual behavior that's not considered welcome, often saying and doing things that are inappropriate. It also contains some of the language areas of our brain. So again, our ability to put our thoughts into words and then to understand what other people are conveying to us and or what we're reading. So I want to ask you to do a simple demonstration of the temporal bone's unique vulnerability. I'll tell you what that means in a minute. So as you're sitting here, just put some light pressure on the top of your head. So kind of where your frontal lobe is. You push in there. Now, by contrast, light pressure on your temples, that's on top of your temporal lobe. And what do you notice? My guess is that you're noticing that, I feel sensation when I push here, but not here. What does this mean? This means that you are seeing in real time that your temporal bone is thin. It is the thinnest bone in your skull, and it is very, very vulnerable to injury. And so if somebody has had injury to their temporal lobe, then they may have some of the consequences that I'm going to discuss now. You could have damage to your hippocampus. It's a small but mighty part of your brain that sits there between your temporal lobes, and it processes and remembers information for you. Very important, but it's also vulnerable to damage. The ability to understand and recognize not only words, as I've already mentioned, but objects, what objects mean. The ability to pull together thoughts and communicate them. People describe this as tip of the tongue syndrome, and all of us have had that. You're like, oh God, what was that actor's name? See him, can't, that's his name. Brad Pitt, right? So we all have those moments, but for somebody living with temporal lobe injury consequences, that is their norm. Damage to the amygdala. All right, so that is part of your brain that helps us experience and process emotions such as fear and anxiety. So if there's damage to any of these critical areas that really help us regulate our behavior, that could really lead to criminal justice involvement. If you add on top the poor judgment, decision-making, impulse control. So what's important, I believe, for peer specialists and honestly anybody, is how might this current behavior that we're seeing as a result of a probable brain injury or diagnosed brain injury impact on their lives? How might have this contributed to their involvement in the criminal justice system? And just remember that I'm not excusing bad behavior, but these are all common signs and symptoms of brain injury. And it can look like, and I've heard people say, well, he's got a personality disorder. Maybe, but maybe this inability to kind of see beyond their own selves is related to living with a brain injury. So this is something I hope you remember, and that is what we refer to as the fingerprint of brain injury. Just what I described to you is the damage to the frontal and temporal lobes, as well as that beautiful hippocampus, damage to those critical parts of our brain that really regulate our behavior is called the fingerprint of brain injury. It can happen from a traumatic brain injury, or it can happen from multiple overdoses. It can happen from lack of oxygen, from strangulation. So these are really important parts of the mature brain. And if somebody has had a challenge there, it very well could be the result of damage to those critical, vulnerable parts of our brain. So let's talk about some real life consequences. So this is somebody, this is actually somebody and another somebody and another somebody, and I kind of put their stories together to share some real life consequences of an individual living with a severe traumatic brain injury. And this individual had at least two prior moderate to severe traumatic brain injuries before the age of 10. Now, when I sat down with this individual, they were a transition age youth. They weren't quite out of their teens yet, but heading in that direction. And I initially sat down with them because I'd had a pretty significant injury. They'd been riding, let's call it a moped, without a helmet, with substances on board, and driving in an unsafe manner. And so they were hit by a car. When I sat down with this person, I said, I understand you've had this more recent brain injury, and I'm going to ask you about any prior brain injury. So this last one happened at 19. When I started asking the questions of the brain injury screening tool, I learned that they had two brain injuries, one of which was so severe they had staples in of their skull, right? They had to spend a few nights in hospital. I said, well, tell me what it was like for you in middle school. Remember I talked about middle school? And he and his had one of his parents with him, looked at each other and started laughing. I'm like, well, give me some information here. And his mom said, well, he really had a hard time sitting still. He was getting disciplined all the time. And I really advocated for him and to get some special services. And so he was put in a contained classroom for kids with challenges, only 15 kids, two teaching assistants and the special educator. And I said, well, how was that for you? He said, it was the best year of my life. So this kid really needed that structure imposed upon him. Those injuries, those two injuries before the age of 10, really impacted his ability to navigate that transition to middle school. And he had difficulty with understanding what he was hearing and what he was seeing. And so what he would do would be to give you the hard stare. So keep that in mind. He would say and do things that ticked people off. So what happened when the above intersected when he was approached by a law enforcement officer in the community? He was in front of his aunt's house in a part of town that has a lot of drug activity. There was a police helicopter overhead. They were looking for somebody. And he was there in the front yard. His personal support staff was in his aunt's house getting lunch together. And while this was happening, a police cruiser pulled up to the curb, and an officer got out of the car and approached this individual. And this individual, instead of saying, officer, how can I help you? He started staring at him. He started getting in the officer's face. He started saying, what the F do you want from me? And then the officer said, who the F do you think you? And so they were like nose to nose. And so we all know that could have ended very badly for that young man. His support staff person looked out the window, saw what was happening, came out, and he said, officer, this young man has a brain injury. And the officer stood down and he said, thank you for sharing that with me. I am looking for A, B, or C, whatever it was they were looking for. So, possible tragedy averted. But that is just a sense of how folks living with a brain injury and the brain injury related challenges absolutely look like threatening behavior, especially in a law enforcement context. So now I'm going to shift over to our friend, the parietal lobe. And it doesn't have as much to do with behaviors. I typically don't spend a lot of time on it when I'm teaching. But I think for those of us who are new to brain injury and really want to dig in, I think it's important to know that this back part of our both sides, the parietal lobe, it's really important to our ability to use our senses, to be able to navigate our environment. So what does spatial awareness means? It means that I see that curb or step coming up and I'm going to pick up my foot accordingly. So it really helps with our coordination and our movement. It also has a part of within the parietal lobe, called the Wernicke area, that's not on the test, that's responsible for matching written words with a sound of speech, a sound of spoken speech. So it helps people understand what's being said to them. So it's good to know, that somebody may have been hurt in that part of their brain. And so the consequences of a parietal lobe injury, and this can happen if somebody is T-boned. So they're driving along and boom, they're hit on the side of their vehicle and their head goes back and forth this way. So that is how that can very easily be injured, as well as assaults and falls. So they could have difficulty around getting around new environments, new places, trouble picking things up, using tools and equipment, difficulty understanding. Often their speech is fluent, but hard for others to understand because they're using filler words. They're using non-existent or wrong words. So they're substituting. So for example, Bob Woodruff is a journalist living with a brain injury. And in an early interview after his brain injury, he said, yeah, we're doing some outreach into the little cities. And you're like, what is he talking about? Well, he meant to say, I believe, rural areas, given the conversation, but he couldn't pull that out. He couldn't pull out small towns or rural communities. So he said little cities. He substituted. So that's just an example of how somebody may misname something. I mean, I've been called a waitress when I was somebody's rehabilitation counselor. So you can see how the category might apply. Waitress is a female who provides a service, but it's not what I was doing at the time. So why is this important for peer specialists? If somebody does have some of these parietal lobe related conditions, helping people become familiar with new environments, encouraging them to get out to new environments, because what can happen is people get very afraid if they're going to fall, they're going to trip, they're going to look foolish, and they start to isolate. So understanding that and then getting folks to feel a little bit more comfortable navigating and using some strategies to navigate the new environment, a new environment canes. Even if somebody's relatively young, there may be some resistance to that, but it can be very helpful to kind of ground yourself in the environment. So again, you can reflect on how some of these things may have contributed to involvement in the criminal justice system. If that young man whose situation I just described didn't have a staff person there to explain for him what was going on with him, he very well could have started a more intense altercation with the officer and ended up arrested. So let's talk about the occipital lobe, and that is the part of the brain that controls vision. So it interprets what our eyes are seeing. And if somebody has damage to that part of their brain, they may have trouble with what's called visual discrimination. So even though the occipital lobe does not have behavioral consequences typically, it still can cause a lot of functional problems that can lead to depression. And again, as I mentioned earlier, isolation. So difficulty processing what your eyes are seeing, blindness or blind spots, visual distortion. So some things look bigger or smaller than they really are. Visual inattention. What does that mean? So you are not able to see something out of maybe one part of your visual field. So if my occipital lobe can't interpret what's going on the left side of my visual field or the right side, I probably have no business driving until that's addressed. Understanding what we see. So it's called spatial analysis, but just being, that is a tire. That is a garden, color discrimination, object and face recognition. Think about how challenging it would be to be living with the inability to recognize people over time, your colleagues, your neighbors, and you constantly feel like you're meeting new people and the person is like, we've had this conversation and I'm, Stacia lived next door to you for the past 2 years. And then depth perception. And so that can really impact even being able to navigate your kitchen safely. And of course, it would have consequences for navigating the community on foot, by bike, or by car. So all these things can really impact a person's quality of life. And as a consequence of that, people can really become depressed and anxious and isolated. So I want to give you an exercise that I am taking on faith that you're gonna try. And it's the closest thing that I've come up with to really simulate what it feels like to know you know how to do something like work, be a good parent, be a good partner. You know how to do it. The information is in your brain, the skill is up there, but you can't apply it. Or you can apply, but it takes you 10 times longer to do something. It only took you a few minutes before your injury. So if you have a pen or pencil available to you, pick it up, find a blank piece of paper, and write your name. I'm assuming most of us have been doing this for years. And I am going to write my name. If you are a person who prints, feel free. If you have beautiful cursive handwriting, go for it. I have a long name. Anastasia Edmonston is a mouthful, and it takes a lot of time writing it, but I did it quickly. And I don't know if you can see it. I know it's backwards. But sure, that looks like my signature. Doing it for years. Second part of this exercise, and this is an empathy exercise, is I'm going to put that same pencil or pen in my non-dominant hand. God help me, I'm going to write my name with my non-dominant hand. So you go ahead and do that as well. That don't look so good. Look at that compared to the first example. But I know how to write my name. Why did it take me 10 times longer and it doesn't look so good? Now I need a fresh piece of paper because I use up all my space. For the third step of this exercise, I'm going to write my name with my non-dominant hand while picking my right foot up off the floor and moving it counterclockwise while writing my name with my non-dominant hand. Go ahead, you try it as well. I'm asking you to do this. I just did this morning with a room full of police officers and first responders. And as we were doing this with them, we walked around the room saying, that is a bad work product. I cannot believe that you think I'm going to pay you for that garbage. Why is it taking you so long to do that? So make believe that is your job, to write your name for 8 hours a day. But you can apply it to anything. So I know how to write my name. You know how to write your name. Doing something that was so well learned now takes so much longer and so much effort. And despite that time and effort, doesn't look the same. So I think that's a really good way of putting yourselves into the shoes of somebody who can't do what they know they have mastered in the past. So it's really, really challenging. It's also cognitively exhausting. And I don't know about you, but when I'm tired and feeling like I'm screwing up over and over again, I start to get irritated. I start to get ticked off. And I may not be the most pleasant person to be around. And eventually that anger over time can turn right into depression. So just think, how would you feel? How would your mood, your self-confidence, your self-esteem be affected if you couldn't do the things you had done for your whole adult life? Think how exhausting that would be mentally as well as physically. And how would others look at you? I have worked with people who had just a mild TBI, go back to work without treatment, thinking they're fine, really struggle, and have their supervisor totally dismiss their struggle and say, the first thing that they would say to them in giving them feedback about their poor work performance is, you must be looking for another job. Oh, maybe you and your boyfriend broke up and you're just so depressed. Maybe just riding the clock. I mean, all these things can be interpreted as a behavior, unwelcome behavior, as opposed to a symptom of a brain injury. So that's just one consequence. Let's talk about some of the others. These are signs and symptoms. So the damage to the frontal, the temporal, the occipital, and the parietal. What does that look like in the real world? Inconsistent performance of tasks and daily routines. One day they got it, the next day they don't. When somebody is incarcerated, there is a routine. Some days maybe they don't need a lot of prodding or reminding. Other days, not so good. They need a lot of reminders. Their inability to perform may look like they're being difficult to recalling previously learned information that they seem to have down just yesterday. Difficulty learning, appearing inattentive. There's a lot of this. And how does that look? That looks like they could care less. They look like they are not interested in what you are saying. That feels bad to be on the receiving end of that. They don't follow through. They talk a good game. They say or do things without thinking it through. The other thing that happens often is dominating conversations, interrupting others. I know that I feel that that's a rude behavior. Hey, come on, get a word in edgewise. And again, people who don't know that overspeaking, that taking over the conversation, very well could be because the person is afraid they're going to forget this really important thing they want to get across. And so it just comes flowing out of them without any stopping, without checking in with the other person. And they can get stuck on one way of doing something, really inflexible, not taking others' advice, my way or the highway, very argumentative. And so having a person who cannot adjust their behavior, their point of view, based on feedback from, it could be a supervisor, it could be a correctional officer, it could be a loved one. It can really make it difficult for that person to, benefit from support from others. So here's a few more signs and symptoms. And these are more physical. Wears an eye patch, or it looks like they have a prism on one of their eyeglasses, lenses. So this is to help with double vision. They don't make eye contact. This is really important, especially in the criminal legal system, from interaction with law enforcement, into intake, and then into being brought into the criminal justice facility, the detention center, or the prison. Folks can't make eye contact for a lot of reasons, but with brain injury, my first go-to is, I wonder if their optic nerve has been damaged, and they cannot literally move their eyeballs in space. It also could explain the staring. And so once you understand that the person's not making eye contact because of that possible physical consequence of a brain injury, you're more likely to maybe cut them a break. So that is not uncommon. Walks with a limp, drags one foot, limited use of one side of their body, or poor coordination. So again, that's from damage to the brain. That's affecting the parts that the brain's trying to communicate to. Like, okay, arm, up you go. Not there. Okay, leg, pick up. Nope, can't do it. Has a scar in their throat. So often folks who had a really significant injury had to be intubated to open their airway. The EMS folks did it, or it was done very shortly after they entered the trauma center. That's a good tip-off. So that's an intubation scar, and that's a clue. And then I already mentioned the scars on the head. So the temporal lobe, there's a horseshoe-shaped scar on the side of their head. And again, remember, it's the thinnest bone in your skull. If that's been breached, if that has been cracked, they will have staples in there. And there's a very, that side of that scar is pretty telling. It talks like their mouth is full of marbles, difficulty coordinating the mechanics of speech. Are they drunk? Or do they have damage to the part of their brain that coordinates their tongue, lip, and jaw in order to produce smooth, understandable, legible speech? So we take it for granted, but it's a very complicated process, and it can really make conversation challenging, and it's exhausting. The speech therapist, if that person was lucky enough to have therapy at some point in their journey, will ask them to over articulate. That'll help them being understood, and you can certainly make that suggestion. And then you can model it by talking a bit slower and at an even pace. But even that takes some mindfulness and some practice. And when we're stressed out, we might not be able to take that strategy and use it consistently. And then if somebody does have those challenges expressing themselves, they can't pull the word out. Sometimes what does flow freely are curse words. And it'll be F this and F that and blank, blankety blank. How rude, how disrespectful. Yeah, but it also could be that's the only word that's coming out of their mouth reliably for whatever reason. And it really poses a barrier to engaging and being understood by others. So let's just do a little review of what we've covered so far. Multiple mild TBIs can magnify the impact of injury. So each one is additive to the challenges a person may face. Most brain injuries are mild, and I don't think I said this earlier, but now's the time. The majority of people who get a mild TBI or a concussion, I would say about 80 to 85% of people who have a mild TBI or concussion are back to themselves within a minute or a day, no more than 2 weeks, possibly if it's a lingering problem with the post-concussion recovery, maybe 3 months. But the majority of us who've had a concussion are back to ourselves pretty quickly. And then that increased risk of behavioral health challenges and criminal justice involvement. So what co-occurs and can make the likelihood of criminal justice involvement heightened? So the link between substance use disorders, behavioral health disorders, mental health, well documented. So I like this quote because it's just a known fact of those of us in the field. Again, it's not excusing anything, but it's really important for folks who work in human services to know that when all factors are considered, it would appear reasonable to expect half of the adults under 65 receiving inpatient rehabilitation for a primary diagnosis of traumatic brain injury to have had prior histories of either alcohol misuse or illicit drug use. So drug use makes you more likely to have a traumatic brain injury. My colleagues who've worked at shock trauma here in Maryland, oh yeah, on a weekend night, everybody coming into the emergency department with a traumatic brain injury, in my experience, has alcohol and other substances on board. And it makes sense. They fell. They were in a car accident. They were in a fight. They could have initiated the fight. They could have been a victim of the fight because they opened their mouth when they shouldn't have because of the alcohol. And again, I have worked with people who that's how they got their brain injuries. All of those instances while they were intoxicated. So folks with a history of mild brain injury are also more likely to experience anxiety, depression, with irritability. So that is a common feature. Again, I cannot stress this enough because when we think stereotypically about depression, we might think folks who isolate and look blue, act blue, crying. But for folks with a brain injury, that irritability is a really big feature. And again, it's how folks kind of push away unwittingly their potential support systems. Alcohol use disorder and opioid use disorders. And I cannot stress enough that many folks who have mild TBIs, they never were diagnosed. So let's focus a little bit more directly on mental health. So almost half of adults develop mental health problems after a traumatic brain injury. And these were folks in this huge study, I think it's actually 2 studies, they'd had no pre-injury history of mental health problems. So it happens after the injury. 1/3 of traumatic brain injury survivors experience emotional problems between 6 months and a year post their injury. And they report hopelessness. About 35% of them experience hopelessness, suicidal ideation. So really thinking, is life worthwhile? What can I do? Is it worth living? That's 23%. And then suicide attempts, 18%. 85% of survivor family members. So family members are also impacted by their loved one who's now living with a brain injury. And suicidal ideation, again, that thinking about suicide, wondering about it, 7 times higher in folks living with a brain injury. And this increased risk of suicide persists for about 15 years post an injury. So this is why, in our world, we recommend that people who have this history, that follow up and touching base with them should just be part of their ongoing medical care. They should be asked, how you feeling? What's going on with you? So that's mental health. And I'm talking about these two issues separately, mental health and substance use, but they often co-occur with the brain injury. So it's kind of a trifecta: TBI, substance use, mental health disorder. And it's called the perfect storm. So that phrase was used by Dr. Adams and colleagues because there is a perfect storm between opioids and traumatic brain injury. I'll talk about that first. So individuals with a traumatic brain injury, rightly so, are often prescribed an opioid to treat post-injury pain. Commonly, people will have headaches, orthopedic injuries. So if you were hit by a car, you may have all kinds of rods and pins in your femur, in your hip, and that can be very, very painful. And so opioids may be prescribed. Unfortunately, folks with memory issues may be discharged from the hospital with that prescription. Family's gone back to work. They're home with the substance, the opioid prescription, the pills, and there's their friend, the alcohol cabinet, their drug of choice, perhaps. And so what we see is some accidental overdose because folks will start using substances that they'd used prior to their injury on top of these medications for their pain. So we do lose people because of that. 11 times higher rates of death following a moderate to severe brain injury from accidental poisoning compared with the characteristics of those who die of other causes. And it's something that we need to, let our folks who are going home post-injury, as well as their loved ones, that this is something they need to be careful of. So again, opioids are commonly prescribed, but they need to be monitored because often initiation into addiction can occur, and then folks no longer can get their script filled, and they will start seeking opioids that are not prescribed for them. And of course, that's very dangerous for many reasons, not the least of which is one of the things that's in the supply is fentanyl, which is much more lethal. Problematic alcohol use usually resumes after somebody's injury, about 2 to 3 years post their injury. And so there's a honeymoon period. And as somebody who has worked with folks, in the initial stages of rehabilitation, following their injury, it's all focused on getting better and knocking again. And I'm never drinking again. That caused so much trouble. And, the rehab staff is like, yeah, that's fabulous. And you take it on faith that they're going to stick to that stance because, honestly, insurance companies paying you to do speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, you do not have a substance use therapist in your outpatient rehabilitation program. And so it's not really addressed. And then the person's discharged. And if you have the luxury of follow-up, you will learn pretty quickly that people are back to their pre-level use levels of substances, particularly alcohol. And that sets them up for the likelihood of another brain injury or injuries. Childhood traumatic brain injury may predispose individuals to adult high-risk substance use. This has been well documented in the literature following kids who've had a brain injury over time. One pretty famous study done in Christchurch, New Zealand, followed kids for about 20 years, and they found that by age 25, those hospitalized with their first mild brain injury, even mild brain injury before the age of 6, so they had one night in hospital, were 3 times more likely to have a diagnosis of alcohol or drug dependency by late adolescence and early adulthood. Now, researchers are still looking at this association. It's not definite cause and effect, it's a correlation, but that does not mean that we should not be paying attention to childhood brain injuries' long-term consequences. I'm sure many of you have had training or are knowledgeable about adverse childhood experiences and the long arm that has. Well, childhood traumatic brain injury also has a long arm. And matter of fact, having a childhood brain injury, this same study found those kids, as they get into late adolescence and young adulthood, are more likely to have criminal justice involvement. 3 times more likely to have a diagnosis of drug or alcohol dependency. So, kind of summarize, history of TBI is a potential risk factor for developing an alcohol use disorder. So even if you didn't drink before, following the injury, you're more vulnerable. You're actually are more sensitive to the effects of alcohol. As I said, more likely to be intoxicated at the time of injury. Individuals with a history of pre-injury alcohol use have a more complicated course of recovery and generally poor rehabilitation and social outcomes. So what do we mean by that? Well, it actually alcohol will suppress the regeneration of brain cells after injury. It suppresses the ability of the brain to heal. So alcohol on board can really cause challenges to the course of recovery. And people need to know that. People need to be informed. They who are forewarned are forearmed and can take some steps to protect their brain as they move past the initial stages of recovery and back into community. So I do want to talk a little bit about opioids. I've already kind of set us up for this conversation, but there is growing evidence that suggests that individuals with traumatic brain injury may be uniquely susceptible to opioid misuse and the consequences of it. Again, those risk factors of chronic pain, pre and post injury substance misuse, injury-related neurobehavioral changes, so some of that poor judgment we talked about, barriers to access to care. It is really that perfect storm that Dr. Adams and colleagues described, as I referenced earlier. We also see this in our military populations. So there's been a lot of work studying the impact of brain injury on our military personnel and veterans. And chronic pain often is part of their profile. And that will set folks up to possibly be at risk for induction into an opioid use disorder. And as I said, it's not uncommon for people to be prescribed an opioid. And this was 72%. This was from a study a few years back, and from what I understand, has gotten better in terms of trying to generate some creative problem solving around what kind of pain relief people can be prescribed following a brain injury to kind of reduce that risk. But again, the pain is real after brain injury, head, back, extremities. And so people need to be treated. And the guidance for that, is still not where we would like it to be. So hopefully that is coming. So I've already referenced adverse childhood experiences, and I think it's worth, just parsing a little bit more out about that connection between brain injury and adverse childhood experiences. The research is ongoing, but again, it's this correlation. So adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, represent, this is in the words of the researchers, a step along the way that increases the risk for brain injury. And I am not throwing underserved and under-resourced families and guardians under the bus, because adverse childhood experiences stem from a multitude of factors. So if you are living in a community that is not safe, if you are a parent who cannot afford to get the helmet, whose landlord is not so good about the lead abatement, can't afford the baby gates. So there's a lot of reasons why kids may be at risk and put them at risk for traumatic brain injury. And so, the takeaway to me is, we have got to treat these risks in a holistic way. And if we can reduce the impact of ACEs, we may also take strides in reducing brain injuries, both acquired, as in from lead poisoning, and traumatic brain injury among our young people. That can really help, in terms of their long-term success as they move into the world. So one of the things that we are starting to talk about more in the brain injury community is just, recognizing and encouraging resilience. And so when we talk to peers, and I do a lot of training with our certified peer specialists here in Maryland, is, it's okay to ask people to tell their stories if they feel comfortable. What happened to you, if you want to talk about your injury, and chances are, people will want to talk about it, because there's a mourning period. And one of my colleagues who's living with a brain injury says, they taught me how to talk again. They taught me how to walk again. They taught me how to study so I could go back to school. But they didn't really teach me, and then want to really hear about how traumatic it was for me to be injured so severely as a person just starting out in my adult life. How do I date again? How do I go to a party without drinking? So giving people that space, not requiring it, but of course giving people that space. And for you, if you can, to be aware of anniversaries of traumatic events, and that includes the brain injury. I have worked with people who are nonverbal, and I would note that certain times of the year, they would be very agitated and really challenging and would engage. And a look at their medical record would tell me, oh, that their injury happened in October, and it's the fall now, and I'm wondering if the temperature changes and the leaves turning is triggering on some level the trauma of that accident. And so for folks who have some, of this permission to share their stories, you can work with them to develop a way of managing those feelings. And so one thing that I really, really like, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Wellness Recovery Action Plan, or the WRAP. So NAMI, or National Alliance on Mental Illness, has done a fabulous job of holding workshops on the WRAP, how you develop your own WRAP. And basically what it is your own toolkit. So for me, I don't have a formal WRAP, but I do have things that I go to when I'm feeling depressed or anxious or sad. I will take a walk. I will exercise. I will spend time with my family. I will spend time with my animals. I will, watch the Mary Tyler Moore Show again for the 10th millionth time, because that soothes me and brings back nice childhood memories of watching it with my mom. So everybody's WRAP is different. Everybody's toolkit is different, but just being very mindful about organizing, even just a piece of paper that has things that are your go-to for feeling better. Apparently now it's watching Friends, the TV show Friends. I hear a lot of people go to Friends, so I like it too, but mine is Mary Tyler Moore. So let's talk a little bit, kind of related to trauma, is post-traumatic stress disorder. So PTSD, otherwise known as, and they can often co-occur. It happens in the military, it happens in civilians. And traumatic brain injury is a significant predictor of the development of post-traumatic stress disorder. And it is seen with folks with a mild brain injury. I work with folks with severe brain injuries who do not, you would think, oh my gosh, they're prime candidates for PTSD, but it's not. It's folks with a mild TBI with little or no period of consciousness. And if I talk a little bit more, you're probably thinking, that makes sense. They saw the truck coming into the rear view. They remembered the person coming at them with a pipe, ready to beat the crap out of them. They remember, going into the house where there was a domestic violence incident. They remember, going into combat. And so folks who remember their injuries, the circumstances of the injury, are more likely to develop PTSD. And these two together can increase the negative consequences of each other. So it's good to know that about a person. If they do have memory or they had other trauma in their lives. So let's talk a little bit about the criminal and legal system just a little bit more in depth. And, I think I've referenced this already, but we do hold people accountable. Nobody gets a free pass. The chances are people will be able to meet their expectations, for engaging in the system in a way that's not going to make things worse for them. So being engaged in treatment behind the wall, engaging in a reasonable way with their peers and with the correctional staff and officers. And this can be improved by introducing brain injury informed strategies and accommodations. People have to be held accountable, but they need some tools in order to meet those expectations. And so one thing you can do is just kind of observe, if you spend time with somebody, what are they doing now to support themselves and to build on that. If it helps them to take notes, if it helps them to ask questions, that's strategy and should be encouraged. So I have referenced this already, and so I'm not going to spend a long time on it, but it's just worth knowing that long arm of brain injury, that long arm of trauma, the consequences for an injury may be that the injury itself so far back in somebody's history, but its influence can have lasting consequences and lead them into the criminal justice system. And again, I reference that Christchurch study, 3 times more likely to have drug and alcohol involvement, 3 times more likely to have dependence. So the prevalence of brain injury in our criminal justice system, it depends on the study, but it's around 60.25% in general versus 8.5% prevalence of brain injury among the general population. I mean, what a huge imbalance. So what does it look like in detention centers and prisons? Well, they keep coming back. It's been called the revolving door. Higher recidivism. They get violated by their parole and probation agent or officer. They don't follow instructions and commands that's expected. There's higher rates of mental health and substance use disorders. They alienate their peers and staff because they can't keep their mouth shut when they should. They can't sit in the groups and engage in the way we would expect. And they just have difficulty following accepted norms of behavior, and they just tick people off. They need a lot more services while incarcerated, so health and psychological services, lower treatment rates, even though they need a lot of those services, sometimes they just don't finish them. And they have higher rates of disciplinary incidents. They don't follow the rules. They have more prior incarcerations, and they come back. That's a higher rate of recidivism, about 69% compared to 37% of their incarcerated peers without a traumatic brain injury. In addition, we see severe depression and anxiety, problematic anger. Now, remember, that frontal lobe has probably been impacted. And so the part of our brain that says, keep that to yourself, do not say that to him or her, that behavioral regulation is not in place. And so again, that's why you see folks getting infractions and isolation, suicidal ideation and or attempts, and it's risk to personnel as well, not just to the individual. And I can't, leave this conversation without talking about our kids. These are children, right? Juvenile offenders. Rate of traumatic brain injury is 3 to 8 times higher among juvenile offenders. Half of youth offenders have a history of loss of consciousness, with repeat injuries being very common. And criminal behavior especially appears to increase after traumatic brain injury, if it was severe in particular. So what if there is a traumatic brain injury? We're quoting Dr. John Corrigan here. What can we do? And it's really important to know that unidentified traumatic brain injury is an unrecognized major source of social and vocational failure. This was stated by one of the big researchers in the field decades ago, and it still holds true today. And this is why, as Dr. Corrigan poses, what if there is a traumatic brain injury? How does that change how we're looking at a person? And I love this. This is from our colleague, Judy Detmer. Can't versus won't. They can't do it, what you're asking them to do, or they won't do it. So if you look at it through this lens, if the critical parts of the brain responsible for adult thinking have been damaged, the individual may not be able to make judgments consistent with their biological age, right? So we've talked about that long arm. So it's the fact they're not able to follow the rules because they won't, they're being difficult, they have a personality disorder, or it's because they can't. They don't have the cognitive equipment to follow through. And along the same lines, is it a skill that they don't have, or is it will? So if we think that they have the skills, yes, they should be able to sit in this class and take in this knowledge, but they're choosing not to use it, we're more likely to think punishment. That can range from being ostracized from the group to premature service termination to entry into the criminal justice system. If we think they don't have the skills, we are less likely to think of punishment and more likely to think of engagement and retention strategies and teaching the skill or skills, considering, as I've already mentioned, the implications of childhood brain injury. So we really need to meet people where they are and not jump to the conclusion that this is somebody's personality. They're difficult. They're a hard case. Maybe, but there could be a reason. That reason could be a history of brain injury. If we know that, then we could use some of what's referred to as person-centered practices, which is just meeting people where they are. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's in this cycle here: person-centered thinking, person-centered treatment planning, questions that you can ask for engagement. And I'm going to start with cultural humility, cultural awareness. So we don't have, the time to really dive into this, and I am not a subject matter expert, but I know what I think I need to know when I'm engaging with people and what I think anybody should know about engaging with other human beings. The culture is important. It's part of our identity. It's important to that person. And to just be aware and ask questions, if appropriate. Acknowledge that people experience culture in their own unique ways. And none of us can really be an expert. What it takes is open ears, open heart, asking people about, what's important to them in terms of holidays, family rituals. All those things are really important. They tell you a lot about a person. And the more somebody shares, the more they feel understood. And so one of the things that I think is really, really great in terms of having that conversation in a very structured way is something called person-centered thinking. There's so many different exercises that you can do around person-centered thinking. So if you're interested, just Google it and you'll see more information than you probably need. But the basic foundation of being person-centered is understanding what's important to and important for a person. And I want you to think about what's important to and important for you as I'm going through these next few slides. So we call this in person-centered thinking discovery and listening. We are discovering, we're being curious about people. What is important to us includes those things in life which help us to feel satisfied, content, comforted, fulfilled, and happy. And they're similar for most human beings, but for some people, some of these bullets are more important than others. So basically to have people to be with in relationships, things to do and places to go. It could be a job, it could be a hobby, it could be the park. Rituals or routines, I should say rituals and routines, because one of the questions we ask is, hey, in your family, our birthday's like a huge celebration. It's like the coronation of the queen. It's that important in your family. Oh, you're like lucky to get a Christmas card. Excuse me, a birthday card. And that's just how your family rolls. What is it like in your life? Are you somebody who celebrates, the holidays, always decorates the house for each and every one? Or you're somebody who, if you're celebrate Christmas, you're lucky if you get the tree up the day before, right? So everybody's different. What is your rhythm or pace of life? So I am somebody who tends to overschedule herself. I like to be busy. I like to have things to do, places to go, and people to see. Other people need their downtime. They need just to check out, regroup, relax. There's no right way to be, but it's important to know which is the way that person's life goes for them comfortably. It's important to them. Status and control. Some people want to have some status. It's important to them to be on the, I don't know, PTA, to achieve a status in the workplace, to be a supervisor, to have that control. Others of us, I'm happy if the only person I have to supervise is myself. That's me. But everybody's different. Things to have. You can ask somebody if they collect something. That's important to them. If I know somebody who would collect eagles, anything eagle related. And so to have that brought comfort, to have that taken away would have caused us stress. So just think about yourself. What are the things that are important to me that might not be obvious to others, but if it's not present, you feel that lack of, that loss. So what is important for things like health, important for prevention of illness, having regular medical checkups, having treatment for illnesses as needed, and promotion of wellness. So those are basic. They're not so glamorous, but these are important for all of us in order to be in the world, to navigate, to work, to engage. What others see as necessary to help the person be valued, be a contributing member of their community. So this one's kind of tricky to describe, but for example, if I'm working with somebody who has gone back to work, but sometimes they can be a little intrusive with their colleagues. They'll walk into the cubicle and just take over, and that will upset their colleagues, and they become a less valued coworker. So this is actually a true story. So I nipped that in the bud. I had the conversation, you've gone back to work. Obviously, your colleagues welcoming you and supporting you. But I'll be honest with you. For you to be a valued employee, you have to let them do their work. So before you go into their office, shoot them an email and say, is now a good time? When is a good time for us to have a conversation? Because I don't want them to alienate their support. I don't want them to tick off their colleagues or their supervisor. And then there's issues of safety. So for all of us, the environment, our well-being, being free from fear. So these are kind of the more bedrock, things that are important for us to feel comfortable in the world. They're not any less important than the important two, but the two of them work in tandem. Have to have a balance. So another concept in person-centered thinking is how can we support people without fixing people? And a lot of us in the human services field, that's kind of how we roll. We want to help people, and sometimes we kind of extend ourselves. So instead of jumping to offering solutions, what can we do? We could know what's important to or important for that person that's sitting across the table from us. We need to ask them, when things weren't working for you, Did anyone ever do something that helped you to cope? What did they say? What did they do? How did it make you feel when they said the right thing to you? And it could have been so small, but it's good to have that information. When you had a bad day, did anyone do something that made that day a bit better? When you were having a good day, did anyone do something that made the good day even better? What support would you like? People are their own best experts. So I'm going to quickly talk about screening and assessment. I understand that all of us, depending on where we're working, can screen or can assess, but it's kind of good to know what are the recommended tools for folks living with a potential brain injury or for sure brain injury that can help inform the services or the supports that we might want to give them. So these are some of the screening tools, the evidence-based screening tools. There's something called the online brain injury screening and support system, and that is offered through the National Association of State Head Injury Administrators. A lot of states are using the OBIS, as it's called for short. The OBIS is based on the Ohio State University Traumatic Brain Injury Identification tool. Short, we call that just the OSU TBIID. It's short, it's sweet, and it doesn't ask people to diagnose. I'm not equipped to diagnose. I'm sure many of you do not have that professional credentialing, as I do not, to diagnose. When we screen, we just want to know if there was a possible exposure to a traumatic brain injury in a person's history. Was there ever a time in your life when you hit your head? And maybe you were, fell off your bike. And it just helps prompt the person to think, I did have that time. And then you explore that. And that just gives you information that maybe some of these strategies that I'm going to discuss, that I've already touched upon, would be useful to implement or share, educate the person about so they can support themselves. The HELPS is another well-known, well-used screening tool, often used in domestic violence settings. And then the brain injury screening tool is another one that's been used. So that just gives you a sense of what's out there. There's links to them. If you are able to get the PDF, which I think you will have access to the PDF of these slides. So what do you do about it? Right. So I've given you what it is, where it comes from, what it looks like, what it feels like. So let's talk about accommodations, adjustments, and accommodation. So we're not treating the brain injury. We're treating, in this context, the behavioral health context, some of the symptoms and consequences of it. We want to demystify brain injury for non-brain injury professionals and people with brain injuries and their families alike. And so some of these other tools that we could look at, self-report, she just started having that conversation. And this discovery tools is also one way to start a conversation, but self-report, asking those screening tool questions. And then neuropsychological screening, and that's a little bit more involved. But let's talk about the self-reporting tools. There's an adult TBI protocol, self-report and strategies. The link is right there. There's one for juveniles. So for our young folks, self-report and strategies. There's a lot out there. And then if someone says, I've never been diagnosed, but from what we're talking about, I think I might have some challenges. So this here, get out your phones and you're accommodating the symptoms of TBI resource, because it breaks down all the things that I've talked about. It reviews the signs and symptoms that may be something the person is struggling with, and then gives you concrete things that you can do that don't typically cost you a single cent. I mean, these are things that all of us can do. Very user-friendly. So for example, if I'm living with memory challenges and I lose things all the time, why don't I just put those keys right in on top of my bureau by the door in my house? That's what we have. There's a bowl there. Come home, put that in there. So now I always know it's there. It's a habit. It's ritualized. I don't need to break my brain searching through the couch cushions looking for my keys. Other things that can be useful for memory, processing problems, inhibition, disinhibition, being impulsive, some of the physical and sensory motor problems, and the emotional deregulation. Reducing the cognitive load will help with all those problems associated with brain injury. And they're so really easily accessed if we're mindful. Writing things down. So some people are really good at using their devices. This is really a godsend for those of us who have memory and cognitive issues. Perfect. You put it in your phone, you have a system. Other of us go old school. Got my notebook, writing things down. Other things that are really useful, especially when we're having a conversation. We say this to law enforcement and correctional officers all the time. Repeat those main points. Summarize it. Ask the person to paraphrase back. So, Stacia, in your own words, what did we just talk about? And we tell our parole and probation agents here in Maryland, encourage the person to write it down or put it in their device. Practice, practice, practice. Practice, practice, practice. How do you set up your journal? How can we set it up more efficiently for you? That daily schedule with reminders, a digital recorder. That's all in our phones now. I can talk into my phone and send myself an email to remind myself of something. So practicing. I actually gave myself a note. So one of the gifts that is available to most of us, even after a severe brain injury, is something called procedural learning. That means the more we repeat something, the more likely we are to remember it. And if you think about learning how to tie your shoe, learning how to ride your bike, you practice that skill. And over time, it became part of you. You integrated that skill into your being. And you could probably tie your shoe without even thinking at this point, right? If you're a person who rides your bike, you don't have to remember, oh God, how do I balance on this thing? So I know that if somebody's had a severe brain injury and they were lucky enough to get a full evaluation and the psychologist said they have procedural learning, I'm like, we're golden. This person really has some potential and they need to know about this potential so that they will work with us to use some of the strategies to support that potential. So how do we reduce the cognitive load? How do we give people the bandwidth to take on some of these strategies that can be challenging, especially at first? Encourage rest in low activity periods. So we call it strategic napping. There's no shame in napping. Using a highlighter when reading. I have one right at my desk so that I can highlight important things in the notes that I take. I wouldn't recommend you do it to a library book. That's why it says when appropriate. But for most of us, this is an option for key information. So we don't have to reread this dense text every time. Use of templates for routine tasks at home and at work. For example, something as simple as making the coffee in the morning. After a brain injury and people are back in their own kitchen, they're like, oh my gosh, I don't even know where to start. And so you'll have over the coffee machine, step 1. Pour water into the machine. Step 2, going, maybe 3, 4, 5 steps at most. And you keep that up there. And over time, the person has referenced it, read it over and over again. And the next time you visit them in their home, that template is gone because they've integrated it. They've incorporated it. And until then, you have that sign up and then you can also label things. So I know labeling the kitchen, labeling their office, labeling their drawers, all those things. So they're not going, what did I have? What like, oh no, it's not in there, it's over here. So that frees up their brain. They're not constantly going back and trying to remember. It's exhausting. So we want to save that brain bandwidth for learning new things. So sustaining recovery efforts, individuals in recovery who are living with a brain injury benefit from external supports much longer than folks without a history of brain injury. So what does that mean? So people may have gone through a 28-day program for substance use. They may have come out of there feeling so strong, so ready to really work their recovery, find those 12-step programs in their community they can engage with, get their sponsor. But over time, it's often hard to sustain. It looks like motivation, but not so much motivation. It's just hard to maintain it because of that brain injury's impact on their ability to kind of persist. So long-term follow-up is the ideal. So that's where peer supports come in. That's where 12-steps come in if somebody is comfortable with the 12-step model and engaging in a 12-step program or programs, because they can provide long-term sustained supports over time. And a lot of this can be complicated by trouble with impulse control, poor problem solving, memory issues. I know that when working with folks who are living with brain injury, who are really committed to recovery, often we will write up some hints that they can share with their sponsor about how to help them engage better, say in sharing. If there's somebody who has difficulty pulling their words out or keeping on track in sharing, to have it written down so that they can engage and receive the support of the group and of their peers. So again, some more information about sustaining recovery. It has to be a lot more intentional for folks living with these cognitive challenges. Engagement of natural supports where you can find them. Avoidance of environments that can cue relapse. We've had folks actually coming out of incarceration and going into a community program, looking at more than one and choosing the one that wasn't within walking distance of a liquor store. So staying far away from a very dangerous trigger for them. And then again, that prolonged maintenance of supports. So we're really hoping that there's some new Medicaid waivers that are coming on board. I don't know about in every state, but I know in our state we're hopefully going to be doing some really intentional planning around getting people who are at least 90 days prior to release from prison, all these things in place for them, so that they know what they need to support themselves. They have contacts and resources in the community that have been kind of already connected to that person. So preparation is all. Preparation is all. And to help you prepare and to help you help the people you support prepare, there's some really good resources. So this is a toolkit. It's in two pieces. It's best practices, making the connections for brain injury. And the specific one here on the right is traumatic brain injury and substance use disorders. It's a manual, and there's a workbook. So manual for the professional, the person who's supporting them, the peer support recovery specialist, and then there's a manual for the person in recovery from substances who is living with a brain injury. So it's very brain injury informed. And this is from Dr. Caroline Limsky. And it really is lovely. It's very comprehensive. It's easy to understand, and it's in concrete language. It's free. It's on the web, and we have links to all these resources. I just want to give you a really quick example from Dr. Limsky. So Tom is somebody living with a brain injury. He comes into the group and he's fiddling with his cell phone. He's distracting himself, he's distracting others. And so the counselor's proactive intervention, everybody put their personal items, including their cell phones, over there in that corner, or in a basket when they first get there. They're not singling out Tom, the guy with the brain injury. this is a universal way of helping all of us pay attention to the task at hand, and that is working our recovery. So that's just one very simple example. Making brain injury informed referrals. So helping folks prepare applications for Medicaid, make sure that they have a sufficient supply of prescription medications, making those community referrals, identify the local support, 12-step meetings, AA, NA. And then, of course, our state Brain Injury Association affiliates are fantastic for resources, and brain injury support groups. And so what you see there is something that we created at NASHIA that just kind of summarizes and then extends upon the information that I've shared in terms of helping people make that transition into the community, or helps their behavioral health professional help them make those connections into the community for support. And here's a few other little tidbits. If you are working with somebody, some of the language that we recommend and some of the focus should not be on the negative behavior. We really focus on positive prompting. So don't sound like the authority figure. And this is really more for our correctional officers. Swap out, do you understand? For tell me what you understand. So you're getting away from that yes, no answer, because people will yes you to death just to get out of the uncomfortable situation. So tell me what you understand. So we're on the same page. Make and maintain eye contact during interactions. Speak in short and simple sentences. Speak in a neutral tone. Keep it even. Ask the person to paraphrase. And don't take at face value that they will get it, that they have gotten it. Give people a little bit of time to process what is being said, and then give people the heads up so they know what to expect in your interaction. That reduces anxiety. That is really one of the simplest things you can do for somebody who's living with a brain injury. And these are some other really great tips to help, especially when somebody's agitated, looks like they're starting to kind of rev up. Change location. It could be just walking down the hall, or going from a room to the hall. Ask the person something about themselves, where they're from. Ask their opinion about something neutral, something like, what's your favorite TV show, movie? Ask for their help with something. Hey, I really need to get the room for the group ready. Would you mind, wiping down the table? Would you mind putting these worksheets on the table? Just, tell me something about, tell them something about yourself, excuse me, not too personal, but hey, are you a cat person or a dog person? Let me tell you about my cats, right? And you often hear stories about, their childhood pet or the dog that is waiting for them at home. Praise specific behaviors. Thank you so much for sitting here with me. Really, this is important that you're giving me your full attention. I really, really appreciate it. Don't think anything is too small to praise. People really do need to hear that they're doing the right thing in that moment. Do the next right thing. You got to give people feedback that they are doing the next right thing. Redirect if people are starting to get a little agitated, if they're starting to be kind of inappropriate in their tone or in what they're saying, and really just focus on what matters. If somebody's cursing a blue streak, maybe that's not the hill you want to die on. I'd appreciate it if you clean up the language, but what's more important to me now is that we sit down and have a conversation, that you're able to engage with me. I need to get, some information about your history for the program. I hope that's okay with you. And then, those nonverbal cues, again, the eye contact is so, so, so important. People will feel that first. People who are dealing with language challenges and understanding and decoding language, their senses are relying on what they're seeing and just your general, not to sound too groovy, but your vibe. So if you are giving off the patient vibe, the I'm listening vibe, not the, oh, okay, let's get this over with. People feel those things and they appreciate it. So this is my knowledge check. And so I ask these questions to yourself. I can describe how brain injury differs from other disabilities. I know that brain injury co-occurs with behavioral health disorders like mental illness and brain and substance use disorder. I can describe how a brain injury might affect someone's ability to transition into the community. And I know where I can obtain information and resources for people living with brain injury related challenges. So I've already given you a big hint about that one. I talked about the Brain Injury Association in your state. I know I can describe how brain injury affects social interactions. And I can describe how brain injury affects emotional regulation. And I recognize that negative early traumatic brain injury can be associated with brain injury related challenges such as more vulnerability to becoming involved in the criminal justice system. Again, I'm not excusing behavior, I'm explaining it. And I'm hoping that by having this conversation, that you will understand what it means to be brain injury informed, and then help mitigate a person's risk of either a second brain injury from maybe even mouthing off, while they're behind the wall to the wrong person, and also how to set them up for success when they are released and go back to their community and their family and friends. So I want to thank you for watching this and engaging with it. And I also want to just give you a few other suggestions, some homework, so to speak. So this short video is really wonderful. It's Dr. Kim Gorgon. So if you remember from earlier, I talked about the gentleman named Scott who was in a Denver prison, and the difficulties he had because of brain injuries throughout his life. And so Dr. Gorgons talks about people like him who have been incarcerated or are incarcerated, and how they, once they were recognized as having that in their background, were able to engage in treatment and services and really turn their lives around, really stop that revolving door. It's only 11 minutes, and it actually showcases individuals and their stories. So it's well worth 11 minutes of your time. And this is a really good, just for your information. So I've talked about what brain injury is, what are some of the signs and symptoms, what it feels like through that handwriting exercise. This is a video that focuses on an encounter between somebody with lived experience of brain injury and law enforcement. And this individual has physical issues related to their brain injury. He has some thinking or cognitive challenges, and also his behavior. And he's talking to two officers, and things could have gone wrong. But the officer engaged in a brain injury informed way. And so I like to show this video to people, especially in law enforcement, because it just really puts some examples of what it can look like. And for the rest of these slides, I'm not going to go into great detail, but I'm not making this all up out of my own head. There's lots of good information out there, especially for people doing the work of peer support. So there's some reading there. There's some links there. And there's the Brain Injury Association of America. So if you don't know your state affiliate, you can go to the Brain Injury Association of America, and they can link you up to your state Brain Injury Association. And then the National Association of State Head Injury Administrators, there's an incredible resource library, and there's a whole section of resources on criminal justice involvement. And then our Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. There's tip cards, there's There's just so much there. And I do want to just point out that the life-changing apps for people with brain injury, most of them are free. Some cost just a little bit, but have been reviewed for appropriateness with folks with cognitive challenges related to a brain injury. So really good stuff there. If somebody does use, cell phone or another device. We have information for Native Americans. We have information in alternative languages, the Tennessee Disability Coalition systems of support, a wealth of information in a multitude of languages. There is a 12-step modification for folks living with brain injury. It's just saying the 12 steps in a very concrete way. So that's just a sample of it. And it's also in your resources. That warm handoff resource has this in its entirety. And those are our sources. And I won't go into detail there, but just know that these are, this presentation and others that NASHIA does is based on science and evidence-based information. So, and with that, I'm going to leave my contact information as well as our project manager, Amanda Tower, and you can feel free to reach out to us at any time. And again, thank you so much for any time you spent with this content, and know that there's a lot more support out there, and just reach out to us and we're happy to give it to you. Thank you and be well.